Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be introducing the latest of our transformation seminars. The theme of our transformation seminars is thinking differently about mental health. The seminars provide a public space to explore and reflect on how we might think about the growing problem of child and family mental health. They invite speakers to respond to a simple question. What is their idea to transform children and families' mental health in the UK? They explore areas beyond clinical interventions, important though they are, to ask how we can think about, understand, and do things differently, individually, collectively, and as a society. I'd like now to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Danny Dorling. He is professor at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. But Professor Dorling is one of the country's leading thinkers and activists, bringing brilliant new perspectives on subjects including our sense of space and belonging, social justice and the environment. And he combines his illustrious academic achievements, prolific authorship, with what I admire most, a sense of playfulness, something he puts down to his experience as a play worker in children's play schemes and in preschool education. He rightly takes pride in his commitment to open learning, and his generosity in sharing ideas has wonderfully enriched the debates in the fields he's so expert in. And he's a true intellectual, combining both depth and breadth of learning and encouraging its application in the real world. He's an academician of the Academy of the Learned Societies in the Social Sciences, was an honorary president of the Society of Cartographers, and is a patron of Road Peace, the national charity for road crash victims, and importantly, of Healy City Farm in Sheffield. He is incredibly prolific. He has written very many books on issues of equality, employment, education, housing, health. Recently, in 2020, with Yale University Press, he published Slow Down, The End of the Great Acceleration, and why it's good for the planet, the economy, and our lives. And it's in paperback since November last year. And jointly with Annika Korjonen and Agenda Press, a book, Fintopia, What Can We Learn from the World's Happiest Country? In 2010, an editorial in The Guardian was published entitled, and it says it all, In Praise of Danny Dorling, a view I wholeheartedly share. I'm sure that a national honour is being prepared at the moment to mark his contributions. And I can think of no one better to give tonight's talk about how people in Great Britain have responded to the various waves of the pandemic, the fluctuating sense of how long it will take for their life to return to normal, if they ever will. A regular survey of people across Great Britain has been taken every week or 2 weeks since the 20th of March 2020. People have been asked a wide variety of questions in this survey, including about their own mental health. Data is available, subdivided in many ways, including age. So we can see how we look the trends over time by age across different parts of Britain. And what might this mean for how are we changing in terms of how sure we collectively are about ourselves and about our futures? But just before we start, a bit of housekeeping. If you are tweeting, please use our handle at AFNCCF and use the hashtag Transformation Seminar. Danny will talk about 45 minutes, after which there will be Q&A. The session will be recorded and shared on our YouTube channels in a few weeks' time. I'm now absolutely delighted and deeply honored to welcome Professor Danny Dorling to give his transformation seminar. Danny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very kind introduction. I'm just going to share some slides as has become normal. And once I see them on the screen, I shall start trying to explain how I came to think I could talk about this. I'm a geographer. I'm not an expert on pandemics and not on mental health at all, but of course, like many of you, I want to know when will life return to normal after the pandemic. So I set about looking over the last 2 years at surveys and other data about what people think about this themselves. What answers do people give when you ask them when life will return to normal? But before we get to that, some background about what is normal and some things I know more about. First of all, it's worth noting that in many, many ways, life and health in the UK was not normal before the pandemic. We often forget now that 2018, 2019 were not normal years, not just Brexit, but we were living through the longest pay squeeze since the 1790s. Even then, the life expectancy had been flatlining for years before the pandemic began. This graph here, I published it with Lucinda Hyam in the British Medical Journal this week, and it shows a little dotted line showing the actual historic life expectancy for men and women, which were rising in 2000, 2002, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2010, as they have been doing for decades. And then come 2012, and you can hardly see it, it actually fell slightly for women. The big fall was in 2014-15. But essentially that little dotted line for both men and women goes flat after 2010, 2011. The diagonal lines are all the projections that the Office for National Statistics had made. Their projections based on data in 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. And you can see that every 2 years, the ONS were dropping their expectations for future life expectancy in the decade before we had any idea about COVID. And if you look carefully at that graph, I'm afraid there are going to be a lot of graphs, that's just what I do. But if you look carefully at that graph, you'll see that the falls in expected life expectancy, the falls in the projection in the decade before the pandemic were actually bigger than the falls that occurred so far due to the pandemic. The falls were bigger for women in particular. Austerity was particularly bad for women. The pandemic has been worse for men. So life was not normal, trends were not normal before the pandemic. We were in a global economic slowdown, and the UK in particular was doing very badly, one of the worst hit countries in Europe. That's the first proviso about when will life get back to normal. Secondly, I think it's important to appreciate what it was that hit us and how unlike influenza coronavirus is. The last very large pandemic was the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, but it's been called a forgotten pandemic. So little was talked about it in the decades afterwards. By 1935, medical historians as this quote explains, began to catch on that the interesting thing about the pandemic was the fact that there wasn't a collective history of it. In the Slowdown book that Peter mentioned, that I wrote, I had a section on the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, and said that the remarkable thing was that although GDP, I think in the world, dropped 14% during that pandemic, it rose by 16% a year later, and it was as if it had never happened. Now, of course, there was a lot more going on in 1918. There was a war in Europe. There was terror in the east of Europe. There was revolutions going on. But still, flu is different. We didn't appear to have a mass trauma from influenza, mass trauma being the collective inability to process the present, to understand what we're going through. We didn't appear to have that, whereas, as I'll show in a minute, many people have said that we have had that with coronavirus. And how you deal with mass trauma is you try to develop an ability to process the present, to understand what it is we're going through, and to do that, that's why we look back at previous events. The problem is that our previous events are influenza, and it's different. And although there are suspicions long further back than these graphs of previous coronavirus pandemics, we don't know for sure when they were. And of course, people didn't know it was a coronavirus pandemic then. They would have thought it was influenza. It just went on and on. And what's different this time, of course, is we have treatments and we have vaccines, and things are different. I'm showing you these graphs because they are showing you the pandemic of 69-70, and then the high flu of 1889-90, and not that high, 93-94, and the last one that was a tall high 22 years ago. The scale at the bottom is in weeks. The flu pandemic rises in 5 weeks to peak and falls again in 5 weeks. It might come back in a second wave or a third wave as it did in 1918-1919, but it's up and down fast before you know it. During the previous worst pandemic, before 69-70, the 1957 pandemic, I think almost in the worst week of that pandemic, the Prime Minister at the time, Harold Macmillan, told the population of Britain, "You have never had it so good." And he could do that amongst the pandemic, partly because we didn't have the same kind of news and reporting as we have now, but mainly because by the time a flu pandemic has peaked, you've only just found out about it, and already it's dropping. Okay. The past isn't a very useful guide, or hasn't been a very useful guide so far. This is the conclusion from a very good PhD thesis published by the University of Kansas, written in 2008. And there was a thesis on the 1918-19 flu. And it said, even if the 1918-1919 flu pandemic terrified people, and for the most part it did not, and there's definitely right on that, it was still the exception amidst a mass of recorded pandemics, far worse than most pandemics. It is absolutely important that governments and healthcare professionals are prepared and the public is correctly educated, but we need not fear the flu or future pandemics. If history serves as any predictor, most people will be just fine. This is what I mean about history not serving necessarily as a predictor, although how people are varies usually, as I'll get on to show you, at least as much as they tell us how they are. Almost at the end of my graphs of flu. One problem with flu is that there was a lot of talking up of flu in the year before the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of talking up, particularly by the government, because when life expectancy flatlined, government said, "Oh, it's just flu," and it wasn't flu. This graph is from a publication, the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health, that I and my colleagues produced. The yellow line is when consultations for diseases like flu appear to be high, and the blue line is when their estimate of flu deaths, because we didn't test that much, is high. And essentially they're both pretty low, and there's only a few years. And the years when flu was significant were before 2011. So that decade of flatlining life expectancy was a decade of low rates of flu. But it affects how we talk about COVID, because people often want to say, oh, it's no worse than flu. Well, we haven't had bad flu for a long time, so you can't remember what bad flu is. Let's get off flu. And get on to the main issue. A year after the pandemic had first swept around the richest parts of the world, where it came to first out of China, into Italy, into London, into the United States, a year after, March the 5th, 2021, the Director General of the World Health Organization said that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused more mass trauma than World War II. Now, how do you measure that? It's tricky, but he's the Director General of the World Health Organization. And he carried on. And when there is mass trauma, it affects communities for many years to come. And so this is when we began to worry. And of course, this was after the second wave had hit, that this was being said. And it wasn't just the Director General. Here are various quotes, which I won't read out from his deputies, but they're there and you can see them in a recording of this talk if you can't read fast enough. Talking about the issues of trauma and mental health, and ended up saying what we really need are solutions from this and so on. But the level of concern was extremely high a year ago. But as I say, I won't read them out, they're just up there for information. And writers and experts were also talking about this. And you could do a simple search. If you do a Wikipedia search for worst pandemics in history, this is the ranking you get. You get the Black Death, you get the Spanish flu, which is why I've talked about 1918, 1919 so much. The plague of St. Justinian, which almost none of you have heard of because it was so long ago. HIV, an estimate of 36 million deaths worldwide. And then fifth, you get COVID-19, varying between 6 and 24 million, depending on who you believe. And of course, climbing all the time. So it won't be long before it exceeds AIDS and it slowly works its way up. Now, this is a very misleading list because, well, world population has increased massively since the plague of St. Justinian. But also you could put other pandemics or epidemics in there, or things that people have called epidemics. The epidemic of heart disease in the last century, epidemic of smoking, these things would knock COVID down. But still, it's bigger than many of us thought, certainly than I thought when it began, because for people who look at these things, there have been lots and lots of small diseases that we worried would be larger, but were small, not with COVID-19. Here are a few more quotes about collective trauma. This is an article in the New Statesman, again, almost exactly a year ago, May the 10th, 2021. And you don't read so much about this now a year later. But this is, I think it's interesting because this definition of collective trauma, you don't have to, as it says, you don't have to be sick. You don't actually have to know anybody who died. There doesn't have to be any kind of physical manifestation of the trauma in your own lives. You can still be traumatized by the event. And of course, by things like the lockdowns and the ending of normal society that occurred in so many places so often. And this particular writer goes on to say that it could manifest itself in people who appear to be relatively unaffected now. We don't know, but we should worry about this if it is the most traumatic event, or even more traumatic than the Second World War, which of course recent events are put into context. Here's another list from Wikipedia, this time ranking the pandemics by the percent of world population affected. And now COVID-19 drops down to 12th place. And of course, but if you look at the list, you'll see that many of those pandemics were a millennia ago, 2 millennia ago, at least 500, 400 years ago. So what we have lived through is really quite unusual. The introduction of a new disease with this death toll doesn't happen that often in human history. It certainly has never happened before in a position where we actually survey the population as much as we do now. We've never had a pandemic, as far as I know, where people have been asked how they're feeling themselves every week or every 2 weeks throughout it. All previous pandemics that I've seen, we've had to rely on the testimony of doctors and their notes about what it was like, what their patients were like, how it felt, and often things, what the weather was like, because they never knew where the disease was coming from. Was it unusual? Was there thunder? Amazing accounts from the past. This is different. This is our first global pandemic with a high death toll where we have surveyed the whole population. And a reminder, please don't forget I'm a geographer. So here's a geography slide. I'm going to show you in a minute what ONS did in terms of surveying the population, asking them their opinions and asking them how they were feeling. But another very useful thing that the Office for National Statistics did is they began one of the best random surveys of the population in the world to determine every week or so how many people actually had the disease from a random survey. Much better data than the case numbers you get from people putting themselves forward for tests, because that depends on people putting themselves forward. And we know that a majority of people who had the disease at any one time didn't know they had it and weren't tested. But a random sample where you test everybody in the sample every few weeks, that actually tells you the real prevalence and incidence in the population. It began reporting for areas in November 2020. And when wave 2 came in November and December 2020, you can see that the highest rates were reported for Barking and Dagenham with error bands around them, I'm not showing you. Over 6% of people in 1 week had it in Barking, almost 6% in Redbridge, almost 5% in Brent, 4% almost in Newham. Whereas in Cornwall, Isles of Scilly, in Plymouth, in Brighton Hove, in Medway, almost nobody had it. Different experiences in different parts of the country. Wave 2 for the UK was still very much a London concentrated wave in particular parts. Showing that graph for the whole period, you won't be able to read it, but I just want to give you a sense of it. ONS stopped producing it at various points during the summer. They worried about it appearing to be unreliable when rates were very low. Then they reintroduced it as we had another wave and the rates went up. Then they stopped for Christmas. Then they reintroduced it again. Then there's another wave for Christmas, and then we have the latest wave. And this is only a few weeks ago. I'll zoom in a minute so you can see the latest wave, where rates got over 10% of the population in certain areas being affected. And we could use that data, particularly the data in the proportion of people aged over 70 who had the disease. You could predict very accurately the number of deaths you got 2 weeks later from it. The graph at the bottom is the reported number of cases, just to show you that the two are related, but the top one is reliable and gives you great geographical detail. The bottom one relies on testing. Of course, you go to free testing as we have done now, and the bottom one becomes completely unreliable. Let's zoom in on the most recent period. So there you see a different set of areas. In March, this is of this year, just 6-7 weeks ago, over 10% of people in Bournemouth, 10% in Plymouth, 10% on the coast of Suffolk were infected, but the whole population. And mortality peaked again 2 weeks after that. The graph at the bottom is the mortality data, which of course is released more in the weekdays than the weekends, and so has that particular pattern. And the way I'm talking about this kind of gives you an idea of how at least I've become used to this. Some people very used, so used they don't want to hear about it anymore. Other people still very traumatized, will be wondering, how can I rattle through showing you graphs of hundreds of people dying on particular days and rates that are really high. But I'm trying to give you an idea of what we know, because if you're going to not be suffering from mass trauma, you have to process the present. You have to know what has happened. Let's move forward. My last graph about the actual pandemic, and then I'll move on to people's responses to it. it's really important, I think, to realise just how much more this affected elderly people than young people, at least in the most severe way, severe illness and death. Between teenagers and their grandparents, you have 10,000-fold differences in rates of mortality. Unbelievable. You can see the graphs curving up here. We lost maybe 1 in 6 of all men in their 90s in 2019 died because of COVID, or will do it in the rest of this year. And 1 in 10 women. And it affected men much more than women. And that isn't commented on very much yet, which is interesting. Whereas when we had austerity, there was some more commentary about the fact that women were more affected by austerity than men. Women were more affected by austerity than men because women are poorer than men, and elderly women are much more likely to be living on their own than elderly men are. And when you have austerity, you don't want to be living on your own. Whereas COVID, it's actually protective to be living on your own, rather than there's be 2 of you, because the chance of being infected is less from the other person in your household. So, what do people tell us? Now, we've all got our own individual stories. You get a sense of mine, I'm concerned about this, but I look at so much data, and I have in the past published atlases of mortality for Britain and what people die of, that I may be less concerned than many. I've spent a lot of my adult life worrying about what people die of, whereas for many people, this was the first time in their life they considered mortality. So we all got our individual stories. We also get to listen to particular summaries of stories about what's been happening. And this, if you're listening now, of course, this is a story of a story. However, and this is completely new, as far as I know, in history of pandemics in the world, beginning on the 20th of March, 2020, and continuing at least to 27th of March, it slowed down, it might be ending, but ONS conducted 86 surveys, roughly every 2 weeks, asking people a whole series of pertinent questions about the pandemic. Never been done before. So what did it show? Let's rattle through this, so I'm not going over time. And maybe this will be obvious to you when you see it. If I had more time, I'd ask you, and if we were live in the room, I'd say, what was the biggest differences, do you think, before showing you these things? Women were much more worried than men. This is from the first survey, 27th of March, just after St. Patrick's Day, if you can remember it, just as the lockdown begins. 27th of March to 6th of April. A quarter of all women surveyed in Britain were very worried. Over half were somewhat worried. Only a small minority were neither worried or unworried, or I said they were unworried. Sorry, I read the wrong ones. That's the men. So that's bad. The women, 43% very worried, 47% somewhat worried. So women much more worried than men, but men pretty worried. Now, what happens a couple of years later? This is 16th of March 2022, so 2 years on. And for the men, you've still got a quarter who say they're somewhat worried, and 4% who say that they're very worried. But you can see you've got a larger group who are much less worried now than they were, perhaps understandably. And in a way, you can also see the polarization of the population. 25% of men not worried at all, 26% of men somewhat worried. Women, still a little bit like it was 2 years earlier. A third somewhat worried, 6% still very worried. But you've now got 15% not worried at all, and another 10% somewhat unworried. And again, you can see that split. And of course, amongst your family and amongst your acquaintances, you may see that split. You'll have relatives who are very worried and relatives who are not worried at all. Now, I'm afraid these graphs are going to get detailed, but I will go through them quickly and not in too much detail. It's a government survey. It's carried on behalf of the government. So a lot of the survey is about things like key indicators of behaviour and compliance, and lots of interesting questions about, have you seen anybody else or gone into somebody else's household during particular periods? Have you travelled out? I can talk about it endlessly. Putting in tiered lockdowns appeared to encourage a small minority of people to go on day trips. So they're actually slightly more likely to go on a day trip if they're in a lockdown area than not. So we've learned a lot about that. But here, and I'll show you these, I'll zoom in on these, so don't worry if you can't read it. Here are the key indicators of behaviour and compliance, because government is interested in, are people behaving, what are they doing, and are they complying with the rules? And it looks like a mess if you show all of them over 86 surveys. So let's just take pairs of these and look at them a pair at a time. So first of all, the brown line is how many adults say they're always or often hand washing with soap and water after they come back from a public place. I think of this as the do you wash your hands after going to the toilet question. Maybe you said yes, of course I do, but we know that particularly men don't. But anyway, very high rates, over 90%, dropping slowly over time till this is just last month when this survey ends. So it's 2 years and the brown line drops slowly over time, but pretty high. And the dotted line is the proportion of adults very or somewhat worried about the effects of COVID on their life right now. And of course, initially, it's very high, almost 90%. We don't know what this is. We don't know what's going to happen. It drops as the rate of the disease dropped in the first wave to that summer, if you can remember, 2020, where it had almost disappeared from England. Then the worry rises again with wave 2, drops again after wave 2, rises again with wave 3, drops again now. That's the first pair of graphs. The second pair of graphs. What proportion of adults were always or often maintaining social distancing? A couple of meters when meeting up with people outside. That's the dotted line. And you can see it's high, it rises to a peak with wave 2. And it's still, most recently, about 30% of people say they're trying to keep 2 meters away. The brown line is how many people are avoiding physical contact, not shaking hands and so on. And that's a bit higher. And I've put all the notes on for anybody looking at this again and the caveats about when the question changed or whether you had your childcare bubble and so on. But this is still not normal. This distance thing is not normal. We have not returned to normal, at least in the last survey, as compared to before. Although, of course, we didn't take a survey like this before the pandemic began because we didn't know we would have to, but we can make some comparisons. Self-isolating. This is the orange line, and we often forget what huge proportions of people self-isolated. 40% of the whole adult population was self-isolating at the start of this pandemic. Even by wave 3, we had 1 in 10 people self-isolating. That orange line at the bottom, and going up in the last few of these surveys. The blue line is what proportion of people used a face covering when outside. Went from almost none because there weren't any face coverings, masks, up to almost 100%. Dropped recently. We've become used to it. Still very different. Zooming forward again. Percentage of adults travelling to work. And percentage of adults who work from home. It's becoming normal for a proportion of the population to work from home. They don't want to go back. And the normal before of the office and the commute wasn't particularly nice for many people either. We've become used to this. That dotted blue line has moved down, but it's still at 30%. I'll zoom forward. There's too many of these, but somebody has to look at it and check these 86 surveys to see what's happening. People who've met indoors is the grey line, and people who've met up outdoors is the yellow line. And again, you probably look right at the very end in the most recent data, and you can see that the meeting up outdoors has risen again, 60% saying that they were doing it. But meeting up indoors, 70%. Now, of course, there were lots of people who didn't meet up with anybody before the pandemic. There was huge loneliness before the pandemic. There were significant numbers of people who died alone with nobody knowing that they died, and it was a media story before the pandemic. Whereas one thing that has changed a bit after the pandemic is that those deaths have actually reduced. People do know each other a little bit more, or did. But let's move forward. People who agree to fill in ONS surveys are not necessarily normal. or not necessarily representative, even the surveys waited to try to make them so. So they stopped asking questions about whether you had positive vaccine sentiment. Once they got 97% of their samples saying that they're very happy about the vaccine, they're going to take it, they had taken it, or they're about to take it. And when it had dropped to 3% of the population saying that they're a bit worried about the vaccine. So you can see the ways in which, a sample of people who fill in the survey are not necessarily represented, and the proportion of people who were worried about the vaccine was higher than 3%. But these things, I think, are interesting. This will be part of the story of the pandemic when we can face telling the story that we do in the future. Moving forward again. The final part of my presentation is coming back to the question I started with, which is, when in our heads will we return to normal? So how happy, worthwhile, anxious and satisfied with life are we? And how has that changed? When you ask people, when will we return to normal, when do they say they think we will, or that we have? I think it's one of the most interesting ways to determine it. If people say we've returned to normal, then in a sense we have, even if the normal we've returned to is not the normal we had before. I'm going to show you how I think the population is dividing more and more into two groups with fewer people in the middle over time. A group who are increasingly unsure, think that life will never be the same again, and it will take longer than a year at least for life to return to normal, and a smaller group who say that's it, it's finished, it's over, it's gone. And I'm going to end by showing you how this is most influenced by people's age, or particularly influenced by people's age, and then a few conclusions. So first of all, happy, worthwhile, anxious, and satisfied with life. I was surprised at this, and we've been asking these questions for decades. How satisfied are you with your life on a scale from 1 to 10? And I think what the pandemic has taught me over this is that people choose a number and they tend to stick with it, and you could have something pretty dramatic happen and people will still rattle out there, I'm happy, 7 out of 10. And you can, I'll leave you to look at the top 3 lines and worry about it if you're interested in these things. The interesting one thing that did change was the questions about how anxious you are. And people reported levels of 5 out of 10 for anxiety when this new disease, which was working its way through the north of Italy, causing devastation in Europe, when it first arrived, people said their average anxiety was 5 out of 10, above normal. But then it dropped to 4 out of 10 when the number of deaths fell at the end of wave 1. But it rises again with wave 2, and it's still around about 4. Anxiety is the one which moved the most. We became more anxious, and we said we were becoming more anxious. Let's go forward. There's another way of looking at those things, and it's a portion of our adults who record high levels of low life satisfaction, high levels of not feeling worthwhile, high levels of not being happy, and high levels of being anxious. And again, it's the anxiety, which people were more happy to say that they were unusually anxious compared to before. So that yellow line is higher and varies faster than the other lines. It may be a British thing. These questions are asked internationally, so it will be interesting to see whether there's still a slightly ridiculous stiff upper lip going on. And we can compare these over decades to previous periods to see, is this actually quite high fluctuations for the UK? But now to get towards the central question. When is life going to return to normal? And the most fascinating thing for me is the proportion of people who say that life will never return to normal. And now, perhaps unsurprisingly, at the beginning of the pandemic, almost nobody said that life will never return to normal. This is the red line on the graph. It was around 2%. And then it begins to rise up as wave 2 happens in the autumn of 2020. Falls down to about 4% after wave 2. But then when it becomes clear that we're having a third wave, and remember at this point, The majority of elderly people have been vaccinated. The magic kind of cure has happened. The disease hasn't gone away. We head up past 5%, plus 10%, plus to 15%. And still almost 15% of people will now say that life will never return to normal. That's the red line. The next one, and we often ignore when people say not sure in an answer to a survey question, but the not sures are fascinating. At the beginning of the pandemic, 15% of people said they were not sure when this pandemic is going to end. And that rose into the summer. And then it fell with wave 2, but then it rose again to very high levels. A quarter of people not sure. And then the green line, and it's up to almost a third of people say it's going to be more than a year, even most recently, more than a year to return to normal. So what about the other side? What about the people saying we think it's going to be returning to normal faster than that? Well, here they are. And you'll see that they were quite high in number at the beginning. The pandemic had arrived, it was a shock. The lockdowns were an incredible shock. But a very large number of people, initially 35%, said that it'll all be over in 4 to 6 months. I was one of those, actually. I thought it would be. Remember, my experience was looking at flu pandemics. You know, that's largely over in a matter of weeks, unless you're unlucky and get a second wave. 10 to 12 months, started at 10% of people, rose to 15%, and then gone down again. And you'll see them all heading down over a year and a half, until most recently we get this little brown line here, right at the end. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but anyway, my mouse is showing into the brown line at the end, which shows you from a sort of standing start of almost less, well, 4%, 3%, but not recorded, a jump to almost 15% of people now say, I think my life has returned to normal. So if you tell the population it's over, if you say we've had Freedom Day, and also if other events, a war in Europe, intervene, you can very rapidly rise to a sixth of the population saying it's back to normal. But at the same time, you have a large proportion saying it'll never return to normal, or I think it'll take a long time to get back to normal. Let's look at this another way. What this graph does is it puts all those together, and I take my hat off to you if you're still watching the graphs at this point, but I need them just to show you I'm not making this up. The x-axis is time, the y-axis is what proportion of people say that life will return to normal in a certain amount of time. The little white triangle to the top right are those people who say, I think my life has already returned to normal. And then at the bottom, the brown area is the not sures, and the blue is the never going to return to normal. And what you'll see is that that's been rising at the bottom. You had this rise in confidence it's all over at the top, and it squeezed the yellow and the blue proportions, which are the 7 to 9 months and the 10 to 12 months. And so the population, as I say, is splitting into those people who say it's over, and those people who think it will never, or they don't know when it will return to normal, and fewer people in the middle. Over a year, 2 years, it'll be back to normal. I don't know what that means, that splitting of the population, but it fits my experience of my friends and colleagues between people who are not worried at all and people who are still very worried. And of course, the disease is endemic. It's here to stay. It's a significant threat if you're old. At the last graph, I think, the last graph you'll be pleased to know, and then some conclusions. So, as Peter said in the introduction, this is looked at in all kinds of ways, regionally by age. You'll probably be thankful I've shown you so many graphs. I'm not going to show you lots of graphs by age. And they were interesting. Some of them may be predictable when you know, but some less so. So, at this time, how comfortable, uncomfortable do you feel about leaving your home due to the coronavirus pandemic? Think how you'd answer that question, how comfortable or uncomfortable. This was asked in March of this year. And the youngest age group, 16 to 29, most comfortable, but still 30% of them not comfortable, very comfortable. And the oldest age group, those most at risk, less than half of them are comfortable, very comfortable. And the proportion who are uncomfortable or very uncomfortable rises with age. So the population has worked out that age is the major factor. They won't necessarily help that much, I think. The media, for instance, a colleague of mine looked at The Guardian. The media liked to include pictures of young people suffering from COVID and not that many elderly people, certainly never representative of the actual population. So it's hard work for people to work out what their risks are, but the responses reflect this. And you have to remember, elderly people have had their booster by now. They've had 3 jabs, where some of the youngest people are most likely not to have had a single jab, but still less worried because of the chances. Let's move forward. There are many, many studies, and I haven't referenced a huge number of studies coming out, but here's just one. And this study was a few weeks ago, April 27th, and it was kind of press released with the pandemic hasn't been absolutely terrible for mental health. But it's interesting what the kind of conclusion is. Had the COVID-19 pandemic not occurred, we estimate that there would have been 6% fewer adolescents with high depressive symptoms. And it goes on, I won't read that. So the pandemic, even among adolescents, made things worse. And remember, the years before the pandemic, mental health amongst young people was getting worse and worse every year. The Prince's Trust produced an annual survey, very depressing survey every year, said young people were in a worse state than the year before. So even for the group least affected in terms of severe illness, hospitalization and deaths, you have a rise in poor mental health, partly because of the fear, partly because of the lack of social interactions, all kinds of things we don't just understand. My conclusions. I'll go through these 6 and then I'll stop. So firstly, this is not the kind of pandemic that ends quickly. But some people will think it has ended quickly for a while, especially if they're told it has ended by particular politicians who want to claim credit for ending it. It's an endemic disease. In Japan, you're looking at wave 6, 7, or 8, up and down, all around the world. These waves have moved around, they go up and down. Individual country statistics are about to kind of cookie cutter slice through those waves that are moving. Almost everybody expects us to have new waves, not necessarily caused by new variants. The current variants we have are quite capable of rising up again as our immunity wanes. Our experts are trying to work out who gets boosters. I think at the moment it's you qualify if you're over 70 or you're particularly susceptible, but not necessarily younger people. So the pandemic, it's kind of like here to stay in some ways. And of course, in much of the rest of the world, which doesn't have vaccines, then the effects of the pandemic will be worse as it continues. And of course, as the population of the world ages, and this disease is worse the older you are, it doesn't go away as a disease, at least for a generation, for my lifetime, I suspect. Secondly, I've not touched on issues of long COVID or the possible long-term effects of people having this illness in the future. That is, if you get or have COVID repeatedly, does it have other effects? We don't know yet. There will be lots and lots of papers that may worry people, or people may worry about other things. At least we've got a growing sense of what this disease is and a growing sense of ways in which it can be treated. And so getting it now is much better than getting it 2 years ago. Thirdly, younger people may find it easier to get back to normal, but the normal that they're going to get back to will not be the normal if there had not been a pandemic. It will be different. The global economy was already slowing down before the pandemic hit, but the slowdown may well have been accelerated by the pandemic. We have less goods being produced. We have less people flying. These are not necessarily bad things. We don't know what's going to happen in China as the lockdowns there continue and the zero COVID policy for the moment continues, but that could slow the global economy even more. And who loses out? when there's a slowdown in the global economy, it's the poor principally who become unemployed or worse paid, and it's the young who are often not employed, or if they are employed, they're employed on very bad terms and conditions. So the normal that the young may be returning to is certainly not going to be the same normal that they would have returned to had there not been a pandemic. Fourthly, for a substantial number of people, especially for those who are old and those who become old, life isn't going to be quite like it was before. There is a new threat. There are 9 out of 10 other threats, normal threats we had before, which are bad news to you. But this is something new. Hopefully not for children. Hopefully for children getting this repeatedly will mean that when they're old, it won't be noticeable. That is our assumption about what happened with previous coronaviruses that became endemic and are now common colds. That's a hope. Fifthly, the Secretary General of the WHO may have been wrong to compare this to a war. It was a year ago, remember, when he said it more traumatic than the Second World War. It's a very different type of mass trauma because there isn't a victory day. There isn't a victory in Europe, a VE or VJ day. There isn't a time you can declare that you've won. It's different, and we haven't in modern times experienced this before. If we have had the introduction of a coronavirus into the general population before, we haven't known that's what's happening. So we just thought it was a strange flu that carried on. And lastly, and I'll end here, and I'm really interested in your questions, so please post questions to the Q&A. Lastly, we should neither, I think, belittle what's happened and is happening or over-exaggerate it. There always was going to be an event of our lives. Hopefully, this is the event of our lives, the thing which makes our generation and our children's generation and our parents' generation different from previous ones. We lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. These events are very rare. They are not increasing so far in their rate of happening, although people often say we should expect more pandemics. We haven't had an acceleration of pandemics, so I'm hopeful about that. But you can worry, and so the thing I look forward is hopefully this is the worst thing that happened in our lifetime. But we do not yet know, and we have to better know what this is. Thank you very much for putting up for me and letting me go slightly over time. I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand back to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks so much for living up to the rep. Playful. I've never heard somebody present so many graphs in such an entertaining way, and drawing out what is essential from what is really for many of us quite confusing data. I mean, there are lots of things that I could highlight, but because of the audience here, a couple of things that I want to draw attention to is one is the age effect that you are drawing our attention to, if I may say, that you're suggesting that young people will, in a way, just step back much more readily into considering a new normal. But isn't that just because young people are always like that? People like me, a different generation, find it very difficult to adjust, and I kind of really finding it's upsetting that people are not coming back to work in quite the way that we'd hope. It's an interesting age difference, and I don't know whether you think that's a problem in the long run or not. But the second issue, and that's something I have a little stake in myself. I was one of the people who said at the beginning, and there was a lot of talk in the circles I move in, that this is going to result in an extraordinary tsunami of mental health problems. And it's interesting that it has resulted in a tsunami of mental health problem in terms of referrals, but not in terms of prevalence. So the study that you referred to is actually one that Anna Freud Center was associated with. Thank you very much for the citation, but shows that 6% increase in depression. That's not a tsunami, but there is a 100% increase in the referrals for eating disorder. Certainly, that is a tsunami. So I'd like to comment, if you would, for me, on two things. One, where is that age difference coming from, in your view, other than young people are just more flexible? And second, how does that anxiety that is less in young people turn into this massive increase in referrals, which is a 25-30% increase in referrals?
Thank you very much. Very, very tricky questions. So this is my guesswork. This is just my guesswork. I think very early on in the process, it's worth remembering that we really scared children and young adults into thinking that they would be the angel of death for their grandparents. That literally it would be them. And so I think there was something quite traumatic early on that slowly over time, people worked out the chances that was less, their grandparents were double jabbed and so on, meeting other people. But that was a very unusual thing to happen to a generation. We also affected them very badly by the closing of schools, which incidentally possibly meant that for young primary school age children, they had to be cared for by their grandparents because their parents were working. Half the population did jobs that you couldn't do from home. And that may have actually been detrimental to health. Or just put that, if we're having an inquiry into the pandemic, and I think that's one of the things that should be looked at. And so we don't know. But at the same time, and particularly early on in the pandemic, people began to care for each other more. And in this, one of the fascinating questions in the survey is one of, if I was in trouble, would the local community look out for me and help me? And I didn't show it, but a very high proportion of people said they would. And then it gets a bit sad because you watch that proportion drop as people slowly realize that actually, if I couldn't do my shopping, maybe there wouldn't be an amazing volunteer for me. And it kind of mirrors the enthusiasm of the street WhatsApp groups. But there was a degree of caring that was high at the start, and that may lead to people being very sympathetic to people saying that they're worrying and, for instance, referring them on for treatment. Before the pandemic, there was quite a lot of skepticism about the high rates of poor mental health amongst young people, and old people appeared to be more resilient. And we kind of might quietly say, why are university students talking about their terrible mental health when none of them failed their exams or something, compared to the elderly population who getting to go to university, if you're a pensioner now, was the most amazing privilege you could ever have. So I think that's part of the change. Whereas, if I was young now, this isn't something you have to worry about very much. But you're right. For you and I, for the rest of my life, this is, if I were to die next year, 1 out of 10 times it will be COVID that gets me at my age, and I'm a fat out of middle-aged bloke. You're a more svelte elder person, but still, it's there, and and we'll watch people having a distance from each other, and that may not go away. And we never appreciated what it was like not to have that, the conviviality of the past. But but it stays. And of course, the worry is something else. So I've waffled on with quite a long answer. But it also, the other thing which I didn't mention very much about at all, but the intervening event of a war in Europe.
Yeah.
And the intervening event, of course, of a war involving a nuclear power. And bringing back that, well, memories that you and I are old enough of the 80s and 70s, and our great fear then. You know, if you want to get rid of one mass trauma, having another worry that's bigger is one way of worrying about your previous worry. You know, you forget the pain if there's another pain. But, you know, we'll have to test this, and we'll have to look at how people in, say, South America have reacted, an area much less affected, presumably by the war in Europe than Europe. And of course, South America had, and particularly Peru, had some of the worst rates in the world. There's an amazing difference in the geography of the experience of this across the world that people still do not understand. Why was it worse in Peru and South America, and why in 18 countries of Southeast Asia were transmission rates very low? Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, not just China.
I'm not going to ask you about that, but I want to pass on a couple of questions from the people watching and listening. One question: is there any data, Danny, on what differences there are in attitudes, behavior between different occupations, different social groups?
Okay. They do ask lots of questions about, do you agree with government policy? And are you angry with government policy? And then, of course, the government policy kept on changing, which makes looking at the survey very difficult to do. But most people are pretty compliant. Most people were compliant and became in favour of government policy at various times. But they also ask questions, you know, what tier do you think you're in? So we can test how many people didn't realise they were in particular tiers. By occupation, there isn't that much in that survey, but there are other things. The interesting group, I think, is always teachers, where we know from careful ONS work that teachers didn't have a higher rate of having the disease than the population at large, but teachers were very, very concerned about the disease. And what you had with teachers was a middle class, upper middle class occupation. Secondary school teachers are in the top 15% of the population by income, but a middle class occupation being forced to work face to face when most other middle class occupations weren't. And I think that's partly why you got the concern there, and people didn't know. So there was certain, and of course the group who understandably didn't complain very much were those whose job it was to deal with this, which are health workers, who of course were at far the greatest risk of things, but it was their job, and so that there isn't a complaint from that occupation. But I'm searching my brain for other things, and I don't think I saw much else on this. That people were not aware of the huge differences. I can remember at one point, January and February last year. It seems a long time ago, doesn't it? You know, I think that's how we could tell this has been a major event. The fact it seems a long time ago. January and February last year. In Oxford, we had our highest number of deaths in the city then, in wave 2. The rates in the council estates were 8 times higher than in the affluent areas of the city, because it was in the council estates that people who worked in supermarkets and other jobs and would get into contact lived. It was in the affluent areas of Oxford where people could flee. There were the people who had second homes in the city, and the students, of course, weren't here. But also people could just, like I'm in this room now, you could spend every day without meeting anyone physically. And I think the population should have been angrier about that 8-to-1 difference in mortality. And also the elderly people in the council estates were often looking after their grandchildren because their children were at work delivering parcels to people like me. Now, that doesn't show up in terms of anger in the surveys. And I think it partly doesn't show up because people were not aware of that. And here's one other point I want to make, and it complicates things. That social class difference was very real and it's been talked about. But remember, age is by far the most important factor in this. You 10 years older, you're 5 times more likely to be ill. Never 10 years, never 5 times, that's 25 times. Working class people don't get to be old. We have this 10, 20-year difference in life expectancy in Britain. So because of that, the bulk of the suffering of this pandemic, before you equalise for age, has been suffering of the middle class and the upper middle classes. They're the people who get to live to their 90s. And that has confused the picture enough that this great inequality, practically is less important than that. And it becomes too confusing at that point, and none of this is much explained. And because all the time you have people saying either this is the worst thing ever for everybody and you must just not get it and go anywhere near anybody, or all of you stop worrying about this, right? And so the nuance of 8-to-1 social class differences at the peak and this 25-to-1 difference by age, and then operating in different directions, I think is lost, but was part of the story.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that it's lost. I certainly, until you just now mentioned it, I never thought about it, even though I knew the two separate statistics. I never connected the two.
Yeah.
Let me go back. A couple of people are interested in if you could say anything about what is anxiety about the disease or anxiety about the impact of the disease. And related to that, is it that the anxiety is just a hyped factor in human misery in the modern age that is exaggerated by the media, that that it's the impact, and that is to do with modern life and how awful everything is?
Yes, okay. Because we have, my father can remember the 1968 flu. I was a baby. It was the only week he's ever been in bed for a week. He couldn't move, and you can sort of say we haven't had anything since then. So you could sort of say it's done. We do know about this. Like, one brilliant thing the ONS survey does is ask about the anxiety in great detail, and it asks, how is it affecting your well-being? How is it affecting your work? How is it affecting your finances? How is it affecting your relationships? And they can joke about it, but at the start of the pandemic, people were very worried about their relationships who were married to each other because they're going to have to spend time with each other. And in particular, women were worried about the fact that they were going to have to spend time with their husbands more. But what I think all the answers to those questions asked every week shows is that this anxiety was very real. It was about particular aspects of life, often about the disease, but also worry about economic situations. And the nicest thing about human nature in it is that a series of questions were asked at various points about how worried are you about other people, about your friends or your relatives. And people were much more worried about their friends and relatives than about themselves. And I think it's easier to say, even though this survey was being done often over a computer or by phone, because ONS were not allowed to knock on doors, right? Because there's a pandemic. So even though the survey was being done either anonymously over the phone or really anonymously over computer, we are still so reticent to tell the truth, in effect, even to ourselves, about how we feel. So if you really want to know how worried people are, ask them how worried they are about other people, or how worried they think their relatives are, and you'll get a more honest answer. And you can tell I get excited about data, but we have this every 2 weeks for the population. And so we can actually see in an event people expressing, I think, sometimes their own worries by saying they're worried about relatives. And as I say again, you can look at the detail, and I will intend to do this. Other people should do it. You can see people worrying about being furloughed. Will there be jobs again? And you have to remember the uncertainty. At the start of the pandemic, people were saying there will be 4 or 5 million people unemployed at the end of this. Economists, skilled economists were saying we'll have mass unemployment because the economy will grind down, which shows how little we know about things. I believed those predictions. It made sense to me. I never believed we'd come out of the pandemic with a labour shortage, but we did, partly due to Brexit, but maybe other things, or a housing boom, house price boom in prices when people are dying. And I think that is related to the deaths being mainly among 90-year-olds, mainly upper middle class, and what housing ends up being put up on the market because of that. But I won't go into that.
Okay, let me just a couple more questions. If you can be brief about it, then that'd be great. One question is the one that you might expect about the importance of human contact with lockdowns. How much do you think, is there any evidence that the isolation and the lockdown increases mental health problems, maybe then or in the future?
How lonely you are is asked throughout. A lot of people, I think, were lonely before. And you can see ONS kind of realising this in some of the questions. Oh, also, there's a whole series of questions which are asked about life before the pandemic. And those questions are asked repeatedly over several weeks. So you can see people's changing memories of the past occurring. But certainly people who say they are lonely are much more likely in the survey to say that they're anxious. One of my favourite ones, but you get a sense that people were lonely before. And of course, quite a lot of people, at least early on, became less lonely because the pandemic gave them a reason not to be lonely because things happened. You had to find out who lived near you. There was nothing else to do. Particularly middle-class professionals in London who for the first time could slow down and walk around their neighbourhood and find out where they lived. You get lots of stories of that. And you can see those in the surveys. But just to give you one kind of example of the people designing the survey on the fly, there were lots of questions about holidays and what are you going to do about holiday, interested about the economy. And at some point in asking these questions about holidays, they asked the question they should always have asked of, do you ever have a holiday? Because a third of the population, more with children, never have a holiday anyway. And the survey revealed the most incredible social differences between people who couldn't fly to Tuscany and people increasingly who are worried about feeding themselves. And you can see the people designing the survey questions actually beginning to think partly of what they were dealing with.
Yeah. One final question, which or it's a comment and a question really. That part of what your talk implied is that we should move away from individually focused services, interventions, and think more about what you started with, which is a kind of community experience of trauma and the impact of the community on mental health, and therefore the solution to mental health being more in the community than individual treatment. Do you think that that's a valid inference from what you have presented?
Yes, and I think particularly for older people who are used to an office life, who are used to a certain, you're stuck in your ways, but if you've gone through 50 years of doing things in a certain way, the idea that this will end, there'll be lots of talks like this and so on. And there's a danger that part of our social lives did involve, work was not entirely horrible for everybody. And part of our sociability and the friendships and the making friends was those interactions. So I do think we need to think about it that way, but not in the desperate, get people back to the office because the managers who've got to justify the fact they're renting all these offices are extremely worried that so many offices are empty. You know, we should step back, look what has been good about this, what we've actually learned and what we could do, but also look at what is missing and what needs to happen. And not ignore it, not forget about it now, because part of the trauma, if it is traumatic, and I think it has been, part of the trauma is let's not talk about it again. A bit like, of course, we didn't talk about the war, and particularly men didn't. You know, you don't talk about it. Whereas this is a learning experience. We have to learn from it. We've collected so much information about it. It's worldwide, so it's not idiosyncratic to Britain. We can find out how other people have reacted. And I think we can get a positive out of the pandemic about finding better ways to interact and live. And that's our main use of it. Not worry so much about another pandemic. There'll be people paid to worry about that, but worry about how can we better live, and what have we learned from this that could do better, and what really matters in life. Because, you know, and again, to end with the survey, there were a whole load of questions about what are you doing when you're locked down, you know, jigsaws or whatever. And it's just fascinating to learn about ourselves, because we all only have our own individual story, and finding out what everybody did and what they found enjoyable and to do is, I think, useful. And I think we should try to use this to work out a better way of living in future. So thank you very much for all that.
And thank you very much. And it's been a fascinating talk, and it would not have happened probably were it not for the pandemic, or certainly probably fewer people would have been here listening to you. So there are some things that we have, in some ways, that we have profited. I hope that everyone enjoyed the seminar, and that it's part of our commitment to providing free and accessible events to those who support children and young people. We understand that the time at the moment is difficult, and you might want to think about how you can help us to continue our services for children and young people and their families. If you feel able to, and if you enjoy the seminar, you can donate to us, and you can share the link that's being shared at the moment with others who might want to. Thanks very much for joining us. We try to improve the lives of many thousands of children and families in the UK and beyond, and we have studies in Kenya, the Lebanon, and the Ukraine at the moment. That's ongoing. Thank you, finally, Danny. It's a fantastic privilege for me, and I think for all of us, to meet with you and to hear your thoughts. I can hear that other book that's being written as you speak on the survey during the crisis, and I, for one, am looking forward to reading it. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.